everybody who will be here today has a chance to show up and say hello. I'm very excited for today's presentation with Wendy Chen. And yeah, and a quick note, Wendy will be sharing slides today, and we will be sending everybody a copy of the slides after the talk, so you'll be able to review them on your own time. Yeah, so hello in Nova Scotia and Woodstock, Illinois, and hello in Ireland. Hello in Colorado. Oh, hello, another author in Ireland. Hello, everybody. Hello in British Columbia and Portland. Oh, I grew up in Portland. Hello in Pennsylvania and Kitchener, not far from where I am. Hello, everybody. All right, let me just pull up my notes and we can get started. Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Wendy Chen, who will be giving a talk on the art of writing historical fiction. This is part of our monthly lecture series where we host talks on the craft of writing and the business of publishing. Wendy is the author of Their Divine Fires, published by Hachette. Mary Karr called the book, quote, a peerless first novel. Wendy is also the author of the award-winning poetry collection Unearthings. Her short stories, creative nonfiction, translation, and reviews have appeared widely, including in A Public Space, the North American Review, and American Poets. Wendy is also the prose editor of Duplo Press and editor of Figure One. She teaches creative writing at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Welcome, Wendy. Thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Jacob, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to everyone in the chat for being here today. And I'm really excited for this talk.
Yeah, I'm excited too. So yeah, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about historical fiction. Yeah, so if you can go ahead and pull up your slides, and just a quick note again, we'll be sharing the slides with everyone. So you'll be able to review them on your own time and access the links and all of the resources and look at them again as needed after the talk. So yeah, thank you. And go ahead, Wendy.
Okay, yeah. So today's talk is about the art of historical fiction, how to write fact into fiction, and the ways that writers will ground their works in, historical reality, but also be able to weave and craft their own stories and make history truly their own. So we'll be discussing, looking at passages from Mo Yan's Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out, looking at passages from Pachinko, and I'll also talk a little bit about my own writing process and the ways I blended facts with fiction in my own book. So to start, we'll be looking at some commentary on historical fiction and the process of craft regarding historical fiction from three different writers. Before we move into the passages. And at the very end of this talk, I will go through resources that some of which I drew on and resources that you might want to draw on for your historical project. So the first author, of course, Don DeLillo, who wrote the novel Libra, that is about Lee Harvey Oswald and the JFK assassination. And that, historical event has a lot of mystery to it. And it also has some facts that we know. And so the novel is really a kind of fictionalized, imagined depiction about sort of the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. And in an interview for Rolling Stone, Don DeLillo says, I think fiction rescues history from its confusions. It can do this in the somewhat superficial way of filling in blank spaces. but it can also operate in a deeper way, providing the balance and rhythm we don't experience in our daily lives, in our real lives. So the novel, which is within history, can also operate outside it, correcting, clearing up, and perhaps most important of all, finding rhythms and symmetries that we simply don't encounter elsewhere. So, what is particularly striking about this quote to me is thinking about um, the ways that uh, novels and stories can be placed within history, but also operating outside of it. And that tension of where the novel is located as a piece of fiction, as a craft, is what gives the story its life. And that is the way in which you make the story and you make history truly your own. Because you're finding rhythms and symmetries, drawing those out of a historical, grounded historical past, and picking out the rhythms and symmetries that strike you, that you find the most interesting, and that you can use to make a kind of new harmony, a new kind of music that speaks to our current time. So, really very interesting look at what is the blank space that you can fill in when you're looking at history with your own writing, and how are you operating and negotiating the space within and outside of history. So a uh, this is from Fong Win, a novelist who wrote an article for LitHub that is titled On the Historical Fiction That Lives in the Space Between History and Myth. Every work of historical fiction lives somewhere between history and myth. Before one reckons with the realities of what the research reveals, one must contend with all the layers of subsequent representation of whatever historical moment they approach. Even the most historical events are informed by myth. Even when you strip away the layers of propaganda and deliberate distortion, there are persuasive narratives underneath it that color our experience of every key moment in history. This is another kind of interesting angle or consideration and reflection on historical fiction, on thinking that history and the ways that we experience history have different layers of representation. And that's the way that we get to know history. It is through these layers of representation that might be informed by various biases, various motives that we receive through history. And that all of history is some blend of fact, fiction, myth, and that that is something that you should be aware of when you're thinking about historical depictions and the ways that you are now adding your own voice to this mix that already exists. And so reality is never, one easy kind of layer that doesn't have any motives or doesn't have any particular angles that it's just presented to us. Every choice that we make in our writing, in our craft, adds to these layers of representation. So that is, another interesting idea to always keep in mind when you're writing or thinking about historical fiction. What is the space that your work or that you might occupy between history and myth? This passage is from now a different perspective. So the first two passages that we looked at were from writers, authors of the craft. This is a passage that is an introduction from a more critical anthology called Historical Fiction Now. And that is a work that collects, essays and thoughts from critics and theorists to working writers on historical fiction. So Bruce Holsinger writes in the introduction, which voices are speaking from what particular past in the pages of the historical novel, and on whose authority and terms? How does the written form of the novel embody this authority? And with what consequences for diverse readerships and publics in a globalizing world? What is the writer's burden of responsibility to represent the past with accuracy? And what does accuracy even mean in the age of truthiness and alternative facts? And this is another question that is central to the idea of historical fiction. You know, what multiplicity of voices exist within the pages of the work? And how do you categorize the authority of these voices? And on what terms and platforms are they speaking from? How do you, as an author or a writer, represent a multiplicity of voices that exist within the pages of your text? And also, what is your burden of responsibility to the past in your book? And that answer changes for every author. That answer might change from project to project. And what does truth mean in the world of your novel? What does truth mean? What does representation mean for the world of your project? And again, that answer, there's no right or wrong answer to the ways that you might answer that question. But these are all questions that are important for you to think about as a writer, even as a reader of historical fiction as well, and to be able to articulate as you are crafting a book. So a quick recap of the three kind of passages that we read, and what are some of the takeaways that we might think when we're looking at these perspectives. So again, historical fiction, what are the blank spaces of history that you might be filling in? What is the balance or the rhythms, the symmetries that you might be pulling out or engaging in your text? What is the balance? How are you balancing history and myth within the pages of your book? How many layers of representation exist for that historical moment in reality? So for me, for example, in answering this question, when I was writing my novel, Their Divine Fires, I was covering a period that spanned the Cultural Revolution, so the 1960s in China. And that was a period of, political dictatorship under Mao, a lot of oppression, a lot of pain and violence that happened, and a huge famine and disasters, and a lot of people who died. But you have one layer of truth that exists, which is a layer of truth that's recounted in personal testimony, passed down through family, as a kind of family story, oral storytelling. And then you have public records that exist. And so the public records might be denying that certain things happened, or it might be reflecting inaccurate numbers, death tolls, and other things like that. So there are many different layers of representation that exist for that historical moment. So one thing is to think about, okay, how many layers, how many conflicting voices, overlapping voices exist for that moment in reality? And then in your novel, that is another step now, is how many layers exist in your novel? Are there layers you want to take away, to add, alter, or make your own in your novel? Which voices are speaking from what particular past? Whose authority are they speaking from, and what terms are they speaking out of, and why? What does truth, reality, fact, fiction mean in the world of your novel? And again, that answer will likely change from world to world. So the first text we'll look at is Pachinko, which was published in 2017 by Min-Jin Lee. It was a New York Times bestseller. It was a finalist for the National Book Award. And there is currently a TV adaptation of this book that I've been watching and keeping up with. Um, Pachinko is a novel that spans almost, many, many decades of time across Korea, from Korea to Japan to America. And it follows different generations of one family and how they have survived through history. And it's a book that influenced my own novel as well, in thinking about the ways that, history might tear apart or break a family, and then might also bring them together. So this is a passage from the very opening of the book, and I'll read the passage, and then we will look at specifically, what are the areas that might have been drawn from research, from facts, and how did Min-Jin Lee blend the facts into her writing. History has failed us, but no matter. At the turn of the century, an aging fisherman and his wife decided to take in lodgers for extra money. Both were born and raised in the fishing village of Yangdo, a 5-mile wide islet beside the port city of Busan. In their long marriage, the wife gave birth to 3 sons, but only Huni, the eldest and the weakest one, survived. Huni was born with a cleft palate and a twisted foot. He was, however, endowed with hefty shoulders, a squat build, and a golden complexion. Even as a young man, he retains the mild, thoughtful temperament he'd had as a child. When Huni covered his misshapen mouth with his hands, something he did out of habit meeting strangers, he resembled his nice-looking father, both having the same large, smiling eyes. Inky eyebrows graced his broad forehead, perpetually tanned from outdoor work. Like his parents, Huni was not a nimble talker, and some made the mistake of thinking that because he could not speak quickly, there was something wrong with his mind. But that was not true. In 1910, when Huni was 27 years old, Japan annexed Korea. The fisherman and his wife, thrift and hardy peasants, refused to be distracted by the country's incompetent aristocrats and corrupt rulers, who had lost their nation to thieves. When the rent for their house was raised again, the couple moved out of their bedroom and slept in the anteroom near the kitchen to increase the number of lodgers. The wooden house they had rented for over 3 decades was not large, just shy of 500 square feet. Sliding paper doors divide the interior into 3 snug rooms, and the fisherman himself had replaced its leaky grass roof with reddish clay tiles to the benefit of his landlord, who lived in splendor in a mansion in Busan. Eventually, the kitchen was pushed out to the vegetable garden to make way for the larger cooking pots and the growing number of portable dining tables that hung on pegs along the mortared stone wall. What a great first line for the novel, but I am really captivated as a reader and thinking about the ways that this opening passage, the very first chapter, is setting up this family. We get to understand a little bit about the son in this family, the situation, so the social class, what the family is doing to survive, as well as the larger political situation. And this is all happening in, these first 3 paragraphs. So other than in terms of the craft of the story that is immediately drawing the reader into the world of this novel, so in the early, 1900s in Korea, this novel is also weaving in a lot of historical context into these first 3 paragraphs. And I've highlighted some particular bits that I'd like to point out. So one thing is, this is grounded in a fishing village, right? So there's research and thinking about, okay, what are the villages that are reliant on fishing for their economy. How wide is this area? So getting a clear sense of what that area is, a 5 mile islet. Doing research in terms of the landscape of your setting and the relationship between larger cities that exist in the area. Another thing is the exact date. So finding out the exact date and how that intersects with the lives of your characters. So 1910 is when Japan annexes Korea, but even that fact is blended into a fact about the character, right? It's not just in 1910, Japan annexed Korea, which is also completely fine to write in historical fiction, but here Min Jin Lee relates that fact to the reality of her characters' lives when this character was 27 years old. So now we see that these characters' lives are located in this specific, larger political happening that is going on in Korea. Then there's also ways that this setting is very historically grounded. So thinking about, okay, what would a fisherman and his wife, if they're aging, how are they survive? How are they surviving in their old age? By taking lodgers. So thinking about, is that something that would have been, that happened in that time period? Is that something that would have been feasible for an aging fisherman and his wife to do? And there's this deep description of what that wooden house might have looked like at that time, right? The 3 rooms, what is the materiality of that house? Okay, it would have been made of grass roof, reddish clay tiles, and also thinking about how are we depicting the social class of this family through the setting that is grounded in fact and historical reality, and also understanding their relationship to the landlord who lives in the larger port city of Busan. And also even thinking about, what would the accessories of that day of 1910 that been like? A portable dining table that hung on pegs. That would have been something that they would have used to save space. Dining tables they can hang on pegs and then also take down and fold out for the lodgers. So the ways that we see how the political rhythms are intersecting with the rhythms of the daily lives of the characters in these first few passages. We also see how the setting is using really rich detail grounded in historical reality to show not only the space that the characters are living and make it feel very like a very rich depiction of a world, but also just depict social class and the lives of your characters. What is very interesting about Pachinko is if you flip to the very end of her text, you get to the acknowledgements page. And there Min Jin Lee talks about her process and the research process that she did for this novel. She writes, I wanted very much to get the story right. However, I felt that I didn't have all the knowledge or skills to do this properly. In my anxiety, I did an enormous amount of research and wrote a draft of a novel about the Korean-Japanese community. Still, it did not feel right. Then in 2007, my husband got a job offer in Tokyo and we moved there in August. On the ground, I had the chance to interview dozens of Koreans in Japan and learned that I got the story wrong. The Korean Japanese may have been historical victims, but when I met them in person, none of them were as simple as that. I was so humbled by the breadth and complexity of the people I met in Japan that I put aside my old draft and started to write the book again in 2008. When I lived in Tokyo, a great number of individuals agreed to sit with me and answer my many questions about the Koreans in Japan, as well as about expatriate life, international finance, the Yakuza, the history of colonial Christianity, police work, immigration, kabukicho, poker, Osaka, Tokyo real estate deals, leadership in Wall Street, Mizu Shobai, and of course, the pachinko industry. When we could not meet in person, many spoke to me on the phone or answered my questions via email. And it goes on for many more pages. But it's a great way to get insight into Min Jin Lee's process, which was rooted in a lot of oral interviews that she conducted over a number of years. And again, you can just see the topics that she researched and she looked into is so, so wide and varied and rich. And that is what makes the world of her novel feel so compelling. So now we're going to look at Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out, which was published in 2006 here, and by Mo Yan, who is a winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, a Chinese author. And this novel is about a landlord who goes through all the reincarnations of the Chinese zodiac. And so it again spans many decades, is very much because it's very fantastical. He's reincarnated as a pig, as a monkey. And it sort of models, sort of the revolution of the Chinese zodiac, although it's not necessarily all the animals in the zodiac. But it's grounded in this, it exists more in the space between myth and history than Min Jin Lee's work does. But I want to read some passages from different chapters that really bring in, so even though it's a very fantastical novel, it of course goes through all the turmoil, the revolutions, resistance, civil wars that occurred in China. And there's a lot of materiality that grounds the world of this novel. Back then, I was on top of the world, bumper harvests every year, and the tenant farmers eagerly paid their rent. The grain sheds overflowed, the livestock thrived, and our black mule gave birth to twins. It was like a miracle, the stuff of legend, not reality. A stream of villagers came to see the twin mules, and our ears rang with their words of flattery. We rewarded them with jasmine tea and green fort cigarettes. I stepped onto the road that ran through the center of the village, only now it was paved and probably twice as wide as before. The squat rammed earth walls on either side had been taken down and had given way to rows of identical buildings with red tile roofs. North of the road stood a two-story building fronted by an open square in which 100 or more people, mostly old women and children, were watching an episode of a TV drama on a 21-inch Matsushita Japanese television set. And so because the character, has been reincarnated through so much, he's really witnessing the changes of what is happening in China from 1900s to the mid-century through its modernization. And there is an intense focus on the material changes that occur as a result of the industrialization, modernization that happens. And again, that is, so for example, we have the Green Fort cigarettes, a brand of cigarettes, right, that exists during that time. Then later in chapter 32, we see the character thinking about the ways that the buildings and the center of the village actually changes. So we look to what it would have been like in the past at this time. And again, that's grounded from historical details about the buildings to the way the character is witnessing that change. Those buildings have given way to different kinds of structures and different kinds of objects. And again, the 21-inch, right, Matsushita Japanese television set that's described with a lot of detail that makes this world feel very specific, very rich, very grounded. So this is an interview that Mo Yan did for Humanities in 2011. Although I was writing stories from history, I looked at these stories with a modern writer's eyes, a modern person's thinking and ideas about the past. The history in my novels is full of my own character. I have always had some difference with, well, the facts of history. My readers are supposed to get literature, not history, dry history from my books. In the future, I think that people who study history should go to the real history books. But if you want to know about a far, far long ago time and what people really felt, everyday life, then you should search for this kind of thing in literature. If people still read my books in a few hundred years, they could find out all about the everyday life of people. History books focus on events and times, but literature focuses more on people's lives and feelings. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to have, and one that you can clearly see the ways that Moyen believes in that through his many books that he's written over his life. Um, and the ways that he uses the individuals in his novels to give us an understanding of how it might have felt to have lived through that history, how it might have felt to have lived in those spaces. Again, thinking about even the detail of the TV, the detail of the cigarettes, what it means to have lived and occupied that time in history. Um, and and that is the difference that he sees between historical texts and literature. So for my own novel, I was thinking, I was reading, I read Pachinko, I read Moyen's Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out. I read a lot of Rushdie to think about, how I could take those lessons that I've learned from those texts that I loved and read and use them as a writer. And so this is a passage from part two in my novel, which is focused on the Cultural Revolution. And it's describing a little community that is a kind of neighborhood. And it's written from the perspectives of the little children, the little red guards of this community, and depicts the kind of passion and nationalism that was so widespread during that time in the 60s in China. The school grounds, which were encircled by a tall cement wall, included 10 school buildings, 3 apartment buildings, 2 administrative buildings, 1 cafeteria, 1 athletic field, 1 pond, 1 gigantic billboard, upon which a larger-than-life mural of Chairman Mao was painted. The latest iteration of Chairman Mao, Yong Hong thought was the best one so far. In this one, the sky was awash in light oranges, the cloud swirls looking more like flames. There was the faintest trace of blue mountains in the distance, stirring the imagination. In front of this landscape, the people were marching, a great many of them, a mass. Their figures were nondescript, almost anonymous, but the clothing they wore was clean and of good quality. One could tell, even at a distance, that they were healthy and well taken care of and full of passion. And the flags they waved in the air were painted in the most beautiful of reds. The flags rippled across the mural, proudly displaying the party slogans that had been carefully painted on them. And in writing this passage, I drew from a lot of different resources that I had. So the actual school grounds that I was describing, that I set part two in, was based off of my mother's own neighborhood that she grew up in. And so for that, I conducted an oral interview with her, asking her to draw out a map of the kind of neighborhood she grew up in. And I also asked my grandparents to confirm and add detail to this setting. And that neighborhood, no longer exists in Nanjing. Again, if you think about the buildings that have, the many buildings that have been built since then, the ways that the landscape has changed, those kind of exist through archival records or oral stories. I also drew from, so this passage, that is describing this mural, which these kinds of neighborhoods that were common in cities often had these murals. And the people of the neighborhood, often, let's say the red guards, who are the teenagers, would be the ones who are drawing, repainting different murals week after week, and really taking on part of this nationalism through this artistic form. So for research for these murals, I went back and I looked at actual documentation of propaganda posters, of what that would have looked like at the time. And so this was one book Chinese posters that had a just a great documentation ordered chronologically through history that gives you many different examples of the art styles, how the art styles evolved, um, the scale of them, what their slogans would have been like. And so for research, I looked specifically at the time period of this setting and looked at the kind of posters, the art styles that would have been depicted at that time. I also drew on a variety of different, sources like Min Jin Lee for research. And, research doesn't just mean looking at a history textbook, of course. It means oral storytelling. It means looking at posters. I looked at, music videos. So when my novel went from the 1960s to the 80s, uh, where the art really starts to change, it becomes less nationalized. You start to get pop singers that are singing about love, romantic love, not just love for the country or love of Chairman Mao. That was one way I wanted to show the ways that the country was slowly changing. And so I looked at a music video. So this is Teresa Tang. The Moon Represents My Heart. This was a music video she put out that was wildly popular. This song was very popular throughout mainland China. I also looked at propaganda movies. So this was a movie called The East is Red, produced in, I believe, 1959. That was this wild production of, orchestral music, song, dance, costumes. And that those visuals also informed the visuals of my novel at that time. So when you are thinking about what is the best resources for you to draw from, for you to pursue and look at to build a world in your own work, you want to think about the questions that inform your work. What are the questions that you have for this novel? And keep a list of questions that grow and evolve alongside your project as you write. So the different resources, and we'll go into more detail with each of them, but you have online databases you can look at, archives, digital archives, or in person, museums to look at objects, like we saw in Pachinko's, the foldable dining tables that you can hang on the pegs. Maybe that's something that you would encounter in a museum. You can look at historical societies, experts in the field, and also conduct oral interviews. So there are a variety of online databases you can access that have archives, texts that are free for you to access. So Project Gutenberg, Google Scholar, Digital Public Library of America, though they have texts, right, that you can access. You can also get access to a lot of academic critical databases, oftentimes through your public library. So you sign up for your public library, and they will often have subscriptions to databases like JSTOR. And so definitely reach out to your public library and see what resources they have that is available to you. There are a variety of different archives that exist that can help you, from prints and photographs to even map archives or other kind of open images that might exist within the country. So Getty Images, that's going to have a lot of US-based archival images. But maybe you're doing research or writing a story about another place or area outside the US. And so you want to think about what are the national archives that might exist for that place, and what are the art archives or historical photographic collections might exist. Libraries will also, public libraries have very focused archives and collections of materials. Those will be called collecting areas or special collections, and often they'll be regionally focused. So for example, I just looked at, say, the Denver Public Library. On their website description, they go through, the library's collecting areas include Western history, conservation, 10th Mountain Division, African American Research Library. Again, it's focused regionally around the library space. but that those could be very useful for you if you're locating your story in a particular place or region. Go to the public library of that space and see what focused collections they might have. Museums. So, of course, there are so many museums. There are many things that maybe don't have written archives, that haven't been preserved through a written word. But there's ways that you can still do a lot of research through the materiality of objects, through the clothing, the day-to-day objects used in one's life that might be preserved in a museum. So, some directories of museums you could access. Historical societies are another great way to think about, if you have a very specific question that's regionally located in a very specific place or on a very specific subject matter. And they're typically focused on a state or a community, and they might have archives, artifacts, books, records. There are ways that you can, look at a preservation directory or research what are the historical societies that exist. And in my experience, I found that they're very eager to engage with, a public who's curious to know more about what they're passionate about. So you can feel free to email, reach out through whoever's listed on that historical society. So don't be afraid. Again, don't be afraid to reach out and ask your question to librarian, archivist, historical society member. Experts in the field. So again, faculty at universities and colleges, authors of papers. If there's an author of a book or paper that you just want to know more about, oftentimes you can find out their public, scholar email and just reach out and ask your questions. Again, we talked about museums and libraries. And the more that you get to talk to these experts, the more you might find other resources or other individuals that might say, oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but here's an expert who would. I can refer you to them. And so your research, can include a lot of this personal outreach that you do. And then if you're conducting oral histories and oral interviews, there's a lot of great guides that give you an idea of what are some best practices to do before you conduct them that you want to go in. So thinking about how are you going to record, what kind of permission are you going to ask them to sign a release permission, or ask for their permission to include their story in your work. What are some questions you might want to ask? And so just one resource, for example, the Smithsonian Oral History Project has a quick guide, a video, as well as steps on what are some best practices to do. So some reflection questions before we go into the Q&A. Again, what are histories? What kinds of histories and myths are intertwined in your project? What are your most pressing questions? What kinds of new resources can you search out to answer your questions? What are some new methodologies or experiments you'd like to incorporate into your project? How many layers of representation exist for that historical moment? What voices are speaking from what particular past? What does truth, reality, fact, fiction mean in the world of your novel? Okay, so now we'll hand it over to Jacob, who will moderate your questions.
Wendy, thank you so much. Listening to you speak, I was actually surprised at how much I'm not a historical fiction writer at all, but it really resonated with me, and it brought back this memory. There is an archive, I think at the University of Chicago, of my grandfather's papers. And my family went there once and looked at it, and there's things like newspaper clippings, and one of the things was his personal his personal notebook where he kept his schedule. And there was I remember so distinctly that regular meetings, where it said June Jans, which was his wife's name. So like just seeing those details of like um how he was organizing his life and like the physicality of I think there's like if you are fortunate to be able to see an archive like this, and I think there are so many archives at universities like this, it can really be like bring these stories to life. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
and then like it also, sorry, I'm going on a little long, but it made me think about how much of so much of what you're talking about is like relevant to memoir writing, especially in terms of the research. And is that something you thought about, like when to like tell a fictional story versus a nonfiction story?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that first of all, that archive sounds amazing, that you're actually able to see your ancestors, like their work preserved in that way.
Um,
Um, but absolutely, I mean, I think that is that was what was very tricky for me, because I was drawing so much from family stories. I felt this deep obligation to like want to honor them and represent them in a way that that resonated with a Chinese American community who had, a similar kind of story to mine, which a lot of them did.
mhm,
Um, but there was a part where I had to think about, okay, where can I dive to, diverge from what I've been told and really grant myself liberty to like
yeah.
craft it as a story. And that giving myself that permission was a slow process that occurred through successive drafts. I
Hmm.
didn't feel like I had that liberty with the first few drafts. I think because I was very focused on wanting to represent that like in a way that was respectful. But as the more I delved and the more I thought about the multiplicity of stories that existed in that time period, the more I felt like, okay, I can craft this in a way that really is true to the way that I want to tell the story.
That's so interesting. Especially how that relates to honoring your family and yet wanting there to be more than just your family's story being told. Do you think part of that came from like doing more research outside of your family?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, the process was like, okay, taking family stories, go back, like asking, family members, man, like, okay, what do you think happened? Getting conflicting stories sometimes, or the memory had changed, right? Then locating those stories in in the larger like historical context when I started really doing research, and then seeing like all the other stories that existed, all the other conflicts that were happening. And because I wanted to represent, that historical story of China as well,
Mhm,
I had different characters, right, representing all these different perspectives. And you kind of had to make arguments for different like political ideals that everybody is
mhm.
is trying to battle with at this time period. And so it was through the process of research is the process of research is as integral to the shape of the novel as the prose, and the actual like sentence structure.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So to ask a question from the audience, Vicky asks, what is the correct protocol for paraphrasing actual speeches or commentary? And what is the protocol regarding the use of actual locations in your novel?
Yeah. So for paraphrasing, so there are some issues that you might run into if you actually take like copyrighted material and you put them in your novel. And you can do that, but it will be a process when it's published that the rights division of the publishing company, they'll have to go in, you'll have to get permission for all of those usages. With paraphrasing, it does depend, how much you're diverging and paraphrasing. But of course, like I refer to, of course, specific speeches, that Mao wrote, that people were talking about during that time. And again, you can also see if there are some speeches that are exist in the public domain or what work has now moved into the public domain. Um, but I would say, when you're writing the story, put in the material that will help you write the story. And then these are all questions you can think about later. Think about discussion with the publishing, the editorial company. There's always ways to fix that later. But that if that's what you need to include in the novel to tell the story, you should just include that.
Mhm.
Let the novel and the story keep on going. Um, and for specific places, I use specific places. I grounded mine in locations that had historical significance or personal relevance to the characters. And so, but there are historical novelists. So, like Minjin Lee does that with real historical places, Osaka, Busan. Um, Moyan, his book, he doesn't use. He uses fictional villages. So there's a range of how you can do that. It's really up to you as a writer.
That's interesting. Did you have a conversation with your publisher about these types of issues?
I never directly quoted any speeches.
Yeah.
So it was mostly through description paraphrase, and so that was never an issue. But I have a friend who told me like she had to go back, like she used epigraphs, from other writers or things like that, and she had to either she herself had to reach out to the state to get a verbal, okay, do I have
Oh,
permission
wow.
to use this? Yeah, so it is a process, just to cover your bases. But again, that wasn't a consideration that she had to worry about before she sold the novel
Well, that's,
or
yeah.
when she was writing it.
So that was not in any way a barrier to selling the novel
No. But
yeah.
again, maybe if you like used a whole speech and that was like very important in some way, but it was impossible to get permission.
Mhm.
But like she was using, individual like quotes, phrases that
Yeah, yeah.
if you had to take them out and do something else, you could.
Okay. Mhm. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Should you definitely change the names of the characters in your based on or inspired by real event story? Or
Um,
yeah, do you have
yeah.
thoughts on that?
Uh, so for example, Don DeLillo in Libra, he used Lee Harvey Oswald. Like he
Hmm.
used that historical figure. Um, for my story, I talked about Chairman Mao, obviously such an important figure, but the characters in the family, they weren't family names. But I used the names uh, to reflect kind of the historical period. I made up names that would have been popular during that period that reflected the changing political situation at the time
Yeah.
because names in China are so grounded in the moment. So, like during the Cultural Revolution, they were very nationalistic.
Hmm.
You had names that were like translated literally, they would be protect Mao. So it'd
Oh,
be
wow.
like if you had a name that was like in defense of Trump, that would be the kind of names that you would have during the period. So I really leaned into making up names that made sense during the period and that showed that that went into the story of the novel. So I think there's a way that you can balance. Like you can, of course, use names of political figures. Um, if the people are still living, that might be a question to think about. Do you want to reach out? Do you want to cover your bases
Hmm.
and talk to them? But if they're public figures, that's probably fair game. If
Yeah.
they're historical figures, probably fair
Yeah.
game. But if they're people to who you have a relationship with in real life, you probably want to,
Careful.
approach them respectfully and,
Yeah.
and ask them.
So you were writing in English, but your book is set in China. And we have a question from Terry about how much of like foreign language to include. Is that something you thought about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely thought about that. And that is a question that I think it has also changed in the publishing world. That maybe a couple of decades ago, it would have been common practice to just translate everything over, right?
Mm.
But now there's this awareness of different perspectives, the hashtag own voices in publishing, where we know that language is always in flux, always, um, always kind of this this material that's very rich and complex. And so for in my novel, for example, at the very beginning, all of the family members all refer to them um, through Chinese familial terms. So they won't refer to each other as sister. They'll say like Mei Mei or Jie, which means older sister, younger sister in Chinese.
Mhm.
And that is supposed to be a way to try to convey the intimacy that they have with each other, um, and also evoke the day-to-day language that people have. Like I grew up being called Mei Mei, little sister in my family. And later on, they refer to each other by their names to kind of show the fractures in the family that that's no
Mm.
longer, their dynamic. And so I think thinking about when you're using other languages and to what effect,
Yeah.
you know, always thinking about what's the effect, what I want the reader to think about in this moment, and what's the argument that I'm making.
That's interesting that you use that as a tool to convey character relationship dynamics. Yeah. Um, so we have a question from Jen, wondering about your process for organizing research. Do you maintain files and documents with architecture setting research along with dialogue and slang as well as political and religious? Or do you add items to your work and research as you go?
Um, I've done both methods, I think from after doing both methods, I think the easier method is the second one, where it's you're adding in material as you go. Because research can get very overwhelming, and you can get so many different details that you want to add in. You're like, oh, that's a great detail, that's a great anecdote, that's a great character, I want to put it in. And I found that by hoarding all of that and putting that into a folder somewhere, it can be so much that when you're trying to put it in, it can feel very like artificial, like you're shaping the story around the facts that you would want to put in.
Mhm.
Whereas if I find a fact interesting story and I'm like, okay, I know exactly where I want to put this in the story, and I go back and I edit it in,
Mhm.
and I put a comment and add the link in if I want to go back to that source later. That was a far easier method for me. But I think authors do both ways. Um, Word can get very unwieldy.
Yeah.
There's different ways to organize your research.
Mhm.
Folders on your computer, actual folders. For my next novel, I'm trying out Scrivener, which lets you like put in images and
Wow.
tabs and everything. It's very complicated, but I think it's just try out different methods is my advice, and then see what works for you, and really think about what is
Yeah.
going to work for you.
That would you put references in like the Word document of like for like one specific fact, you'd have a reference to where you found that?
Yeah, so I would
Oh
put
wow.
in, I would like add the comment, but it
Mhm.
my word did get very, very clunky and slow. So, there might
Yeah,
be a
me
better way
too.
to do that,
Mhm.
but I
I've
would
had my own
definitely,
battles with Word documents.
yeah. Or save them in a tab on your like browser and add them to the bookmarks.
Yeah. Um, we are just about out of time, and I feel like I have so many more questions that I would like to ask you. I wish we had more time, but I really want to thank you for sharing so much of your knowledge with us today. I've really enjoyed this talk, and I feel like I've gotten a lot out of it. I encourage everyone to look up and buy a copy of Wendy's book, Their Divine Fires. And once again, Wendy, thank you for your time. I want to thank everybody behind the scenes who make all of these talks possible. Caitlin Jans, Emily Harstone, S. Calikar, everybody, and all of the authors, published supporters and subscribers, and everyone here who has spent their time with us today. So thank you. And Wendy, is there any last thing you want to leave our audience with today?
No, just thank you so much for being here. If you have any more questions, you can always reach out on my website. I have a contact form, and the slides will be shared with everyone, so you'll have access to those links and resources.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.